Good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. My name is Richard Locke. I am very happy to say that I'm a professor of international and public affairs here at the Watson Institute and currently serve as provost. And it's really wonderful to be back here at Watson for this really great event. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Steve Kinzer, who is a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute. Now, many of you already know this, but Steve is a renowned journalist who has had a very long and distinguished career as a reporter and editor. He spent over 20 years working for the New York Times, most of it as a foreign correspondent. He was the Times bureau chief in Nicaragua during the 1980s and in Germany during the early 1990s, so pretty critical moments in the history of those two regions. In 1996, he was named chief of the newly opened Times Bureau in Istanbul, and later he was appointed national culture correspondent based in Chicago. In addition to the work he's done as a really terrific journalist, Stephen is also a best-selling and highly celebrated author. In addition to his latest work, which we'll talk about today, and I actually brought my copy, The True Flag, he has authored a number of other really terrific books about Central America, Rwanda, Iran, and the history of foreign policy. And I think in my first year here at Brown, when I was then serving as director of Watson, we had another event like this on the brothers, about the Dulles brothers and all the incredible things that they did that we're still trying to dig ourselves out of today. And that was another really fantastic book that Steve had written, and we had a really great session here about that. Steve has that rare combination of attributes that provide, I think, not only tremendous success as an author and journalist, but also as a teacher and a member of this intellectual community. He has an insatiable curiosity to understand the forces that shape the world, a commitment to find and reveal the truth, and that's a very good commitment these days, and a rare storyteller's gift to make all of his works both compelling, readable, but also truly important. Beyond his books, Stephen is also a very prolific writer of different commentary. He writes in the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, the Boston Globe. Every now and then I still am on the email list, so I get these columns, and they're fantastic. Those of you who follow him, it's especially very relevant to some of the debates that we're having these days in foreign policy, but maybe even also domestic policy. I think that we're actually very blessed to have Steve as a member of the Watson and Brown communities. He joined Watson in 2013, so that was a very nice overlap, and has had a significant presence here. Both as a senior fellow and our journalist in residence. In his roles, Stephen has also taught a number of courses on understanding foreign policy, this wonderful course on how to be a foreign correspondent, where last time I guess he took students to Nicaragua, and I hear this time it's Cuba, which I wish I would be able to be a student in those classes. But given the goals and the mission of this institute, which is part of trying to promote a just and peaceful world, the kind of work that Steve does in his scholarship, in his commentary, and his teaching is absolutely central to our ability to fulfill the missions of Watson, but also the mission of Brown University. Steve, it's so wonderful to have you in our community. I wish I got to see you more often these days. And please join me in welcoming Steve Kinzer.
We have never had a president before who was destitute of self-respect and of respect for his high office. We've had no president before who was not a gentleman. We've had no president before who was intended for a butcher, a dive keeper, or a bully. No, those words were not written this week. That's Mark Twain talking about Theodore Roosevelt. They were marvelously matched antagonists at the end of the 19th century. In some ways, they were quite different. Roosevelt believed that war was the only suitable pursuit for a man or a nation. I went through a lot of his letters while researching this book, and I came up with great lines like, "I would favor almost any war because I believe this country needs one." At one point, he actually wrote to his bosom friend, Henry Cabot Lodge, speculating on whether it would be possible to arrange for Germany to bombard and burn some cities on the east coast of the US so the United States could get more actively involved in a war. Mark Twain was quite different. Mark Twain had traveled to places where European imperialism was well rooted. He had seen the results in places like South Africa, India, the South Seas. And he had a very different view of what the role of imperialism was. On the other hand, in a certain way, they were well matched and equal. They were both activists and writers as well as thinkers. And both of them created their own personas. They had great egos and they invented themselves. These were people who could never turn away from a crowd or a photographer or an interviewer. Aware of each other's popularity, they never attacked each other in public. But we know from their writings and their comments what they really thought of each other. So Twain described Roosevelt as clearly insane. And undoubtedly the most formidable disaster that has befallen the country since the Civil War. Roosevelt returned the favor by saying he would like to skin Mark Twain alive. Now, what were they arguing about? That is the theme of my new book. They represented two poles in an argument that consumed the United States 120 years ago and that still consumes us. All of our foreign policy choices in the United States could be reduced essentially down to one word, which is intervention. We're always trying to figure out, where do we intervene in the world? When? With what tools? Under what circumstances? With what goals? We imagine that we're coming up with new arguments and that this is a new debate. But actually, the theme of my book is that this debate is actually quite old. It goes back more than a century. All of my books are voyages of discovery. I'm always looking for some huge story that had a great impact on history, but that for whatever reason has been lost or forgotten. The great discovery that led me to write this book has to do with the scope of the debate that shook America at the end of the 19th century. I teach about the Spanish-American War, and I'm pretty familiar with that history, but there's a huge piece of it that I never understood, that I never knew, that's not in any of the books. During this period, the United States made a huge decision. When the Senate began its epochal debate, which I'll talk about in a moment, one senator started out by saying, "This is the greatest question that has ever been presented to the American people." It was, he was right, and it still is. But that question was not decided easily. This huge choice, we're not going to stop at the borders of North America. We're going to project our coercive and military power abroad, was made by very narrow margins. And the debate consumed the United States for several years. It was on the front pages of newspapers every day. Every single major political and intellectual figure in America took part in this debate. And the themes that come up in this debate have resonated all the way up to the present day. I never ceased to be amazed as I was going through the congressional record and the newspapers and magazines of that era with how astonishingly current all the arguments are. Every argument we make for intervention and every argument we make against intervention starts here. As I was reading through these debates, I thought, this sounds just like what we said when we were debating Vietnam, whether to get involved in Central America, whether to be involved in Iraq. In the history of American foreign policy, this is truly the mother of all debates. Although the big difference is, of course, the senators were so much more articulate then. It's truly sobering to read through these speeches and see how beautifully crafted they are, how full of historical references they are, how insightful they are, with references to Pliny the Elder and the Catiline conspiracy and things you probably wouldn't want to discuss with very many senators today. So the fact that this debate shook the country and was so profoundly fought and was so narrowly decided is the major discovery of my book. The scope of this debate doesn't appear in history books. And so I do feel that, again, in this book, I've tried to recover an incident that was decisive in shaping American history, but that we don't know anything about. For those of you who were not in my recent lecture on the Spanish-American War, my History of American Intervention class, and might have forgotten that one class you took in high school about the Spanish-American War, let me just refresh your memory and set the scene for what was happening at that moment. Cuban patriots were rising up against Spanish rule in the late 1890s. At the same time, coincidentally, in New York City, William Randolph Hearst was pioneering what was then called yellow journalism, what we now call fake news. Hearst's newspapers, which I painstakingly went through for many hours in the New York Public Library, essentially had the same rotating diet of stories. It was murder, suicide, child abuse, and political corruption, and then it would start again. But with an entrepreneur's clever eye, Hearst realized that this cycle got a little stale after a while. The stories start to blend into each other. And as everyone in the news business knows, the way to get people to tune in every day or buy a paper every day is to have what we call a running story, a story that's going every day. So you need to buy the next day's paper to find out what's going to happen. War is the best running story of all. And William Randolph Hearst understood this. He made a point of bringing to Americans the extremes of brutality that Cuban people were suffering under Spanish oppression. I saw one story, for example, that took up an entire page with some quite graphic illustrations, truly heart-rending piece about a holding pen where suspect villagers were being held by Spanish officers. They were not given food, they were not given medical care, there were no sanitary facilities, they were starving, they were sick, they were fly-covered, rodents were feeding on them, and the reporter at the peak of the story explains how he actually watched a mother and then a few minutes later her small baby die in front of his eyes in one of these holding pens. It later turned out this reporter had never even been in Cuba. But Hearst understood something that's very important to the American character. We're very compassionate people. Americans hate the idea that anybody's suffering anywhere. Our leaders understand this, and every time they want to push us into a war, all they need to do is bring out some stories about who's suffering there and how brutal conditions are, and then Americans think, we have to go to war. Hearst fed Americans a diet of this kind of fake news that drove them wild. His greatest coup of fake news, of course, was the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. His headline was, "Sinking of the Maine was the work of an enemy." And he actually published on the front page a giant drawing showing how the Spanish sunk the Maine. You see the Maine sitting there below the waterline. You can see the mine that's attached to the side of the hull, and they actually show you the cords that are attached to the detonator on shore. Oh, it took 70 years for the U.S. Navy to convene a review board under Admiral Hyman Rickover that concluded the Maine was blown up by a spark inside the furnace. But at the time, that kind of news was very effective. I fear it still is. So, armed with this outrage, the United States decided we should send troops to Cuba to help the Spanish to help the Cuban rebels defeat the Spanish. As we were doing this, our military planners realized that it was important for us to find and sink the Spanish fleet wherever it was in the world, to be sure that that fleet would not attack the US mainland in retribution for our attacks in Cuba. We discovered that the fleet was in a place that no American had ever heard of, and that was the Philippine Islands. Even President McKinley later said, "I couldn't have told you where those darned islands were within 1,000 miles." We did send a squadron to the Philippines. We destroyed the Spanish fleet there. But then we didn't know what to do. Suddenly, there were the Philippines. We had never thought about the Philippines. This war was about Cuba. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a far-off part of the world. This brought Americans to a crucial moment. In 1890, the US Census Bureau famously declared the American frontier closed. That meant there's no more land to settle inside North America. This brought us to a great crisis, to a great crossroads. What do we do now? You could argue the United States has been an expansionist nation ever since the Pilgrims landed. But we'd finally reached the extent of our North American continent. Should we then be satisfied and look inward and try to devote our energies to building up our nation? Or should we continue doing what we have been doing since the Pilgrims landed, and that is pushing further? At the end of 1898, the US government imposed on Spain a treaty called the Treaty of Paris, by which we acquired Spanish territories. We acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, for which we paid $20 million. Spain, and also had to surrender control over Cuba. So this was the great moment for us. But that treaty, the Treaty of Paris, had to be ratified by the US Senate. That was the climax of this great debate. But the debate had begun even as the Americans were beginning their war in Cuba. A huge force arose in America, actually originally from Boston, during 1898. It's one that doesn't appear in your history books, the Anti-Imperialist League. This organization had chapters all over America, held meetings in dozens of cities, circulated hundreds of thousands of leaflets and newsletters, and attracted some of the leading figures in America. So the vice presidents included Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America, and a few people with whom you wouldn't expect to see Andrew Carnegie sitting around a table, like Jane Addams, the great social reformer, Samuel Gompers, the principal labor leader of that era, Booker T. Washington, the most prominent African American of that period, intellectuals like William James, politicians like Democrat William Jennings Bryan, Republican Benjamin Harrison, the immediate past president Grover Cleveland. All these people were involved in the anti-imperialist movement. The first meeting in American history to protest the policy of expansion abroad was held on June 15th, 1898 in Faneuil Hall in Boston. And here is a snippet from the opening speech by a Boston clergyman and theologian. The policy of imperialism threatens to change the temper of our people and to put us into a permanent attitude of arrogance, testiness, and defiance toward other nations. Once we enter the field of international conflict as a great military and naval power, we shall be one more bully among bullies. We shall only add one more to the list of oppressors of mankind. William Jennings Bryan, who was the leader of the Democratic Party at that time, was an even more vivid orator. He was steeped in biblical imagery, and his speeches are quite potent. How about this one? When the desire to steal becomes uncontrollable in an individual, he is declared a kleptomaniac and is sent to an asylum. When the desire to grab land becomes uncontrollable in a nation, we are told that the currents of destiny are flowing through the hearts of men, and the American people are entering upon a manifest mission. Shame upon the logic which locks up the petty offender and enthrones grand larceny. So, at the beginning of 1899, the Senate convened for its epochal 32-day debate over ratification of the Treaty of Paris. But it wasn't just about that treaty, and it wasn't just about the Philippines. It was about a much larger question. It's a question we're still arguing today. And that is it right for the United States, a country that was a former colony, that came to being by overthrowing the rule of an outside power, to be imposing its rule on other peoples? Is this the correct course for the United States? We debated that for several years at the turn of the century. The Senate took up the debate in these important 32 days. And although a kind of resolution was reached, we're still struggling over whether this is the right thing for America to do. Let me give you a sense of that wonderful debate. As I was reading through the congressional records of that period, I had the feeling I might be the first person in 50 years that's ever looked at this debate. And I want to share some of the fun I had with you. So here's one of the opening senators, Senator William Mason of Illinois. For over 100 years, every lover of liberty has pointed to this sentence: all just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. This sentence has been a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day to the downtrodden and oppressed around the world. No, Mr. President, we will not amend that sentence now. Not liberty, Mr. President, for your family as I prescribe it. Not liberty for you or your children at my dictation. Not Austrian liberty for the Hungarians. Not Spanish liberty for Cuba. Not English liberty for the United States. And not American liberty for the Philippines, but universal liberty. Universal liberty for which our fathers died. The answer then comes back from a great imperialist figure from Indiana, Albert Beveridge, another brilliant speaker who used rhetoric as the way to propel himself from poverty up to power. The opposition tells us that we ought not to govern a people without their consent. I answer, the rule of liberty, that all just government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, applies only to those who are capable of self-government. This, of course, had a heavy racial overtone. It meant that countries populated by white people can rule themselves, but those populated by anyone else need to be ruled by white people. And that was an argument that was repeatedly made during this debate. Two of the antagonists in this great Senate debate were both Republican senators from Massachusetts. One was Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was a key member of the imperialist triumvirate, you could call it. So he was the Mephistopheles behind the other senators and the real conceiver of the imperial project. Hearst was the mighty megaphone, and Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was the public face of the imperial project. So here's Henry Cabot Lodge, and ask yourself if this is not an argument we still hear today. I do not believe that this nation was raised up from nothing. I have faith that it has a great mission in the world, a mission of good, a mission of freedom. I believe that it can live up to that mission. Therefore, I want to see it step forward boldly and take its place at the head of nations. To which his Republican colleague, George Frisbee Hoar, cried back, "You have no right at the cannon's mouth to impose on an unwilling people your Declaration of Independence and your Constitution and your notions of freedom and notions of what is good." This is the same debate we have been having ever since. During this period, as the Senate was opening its debate on the Philippines, Rudyard Kipling wrote and published his famous poem, The White Man's Burden. Actually, the full title of that poem is The White Man's Burden, the U.S. in the Philippines. It's written specifically for this moment. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. As I was doing my research for this book and going through a lot of old newspapers, I discovered that during this period there was something of a fad in the US where people would write little poems, little ditties about whatever struck them and mail them to newspapers. And almost every day's newspapers contained little quatrains at the bottom as fillers at the bottom of columns. It's very interesting. You can trace the political ups and downs of the moment through these poems. Soon after the Kipling poem appeared and fighting in the Philippines began, somebody wrote one that went like this. We have picked up the burden of ebony and brown. Now, will you tell us, Rudyard, how we could put it down? During this period, Mark Twain emerged as a particularly vituperative critic of imperialism. He said that Americans who were fighting in foreign wars were using a bandit's musket under a polluted flag. In fact, he wanted to change the flag of the United States to replace the stars with skull and crossbones symbols. At one point, he lamented, it was impossible to save the great republic. She was rotten to the core. Lust of conquest had long ago done its work. Trampling upon the helpless abroad had taught her by a natural process to endure with apathy the like at home. Other intellectuals became leading figures in this debate. And it's always impressive to see brilliant college professors emerge and shape the course of history. One of them was William Graham Sumner, now thought of as the founder of the School of the Discipline of Sociology, and not incidentally the inventor of the term ethnocentrism. This is a line that he wrote more than 100 years ago. Ask yourself how true this came. The great foe of democracy now and in the near future is plutocracy. Every year that passes brings out this antagonism more distinctly. It is to be the social war of the 20th century. In that war, militarism, expansionism, and imperialism will all favor plutocracy. Therefore, expansionism and imperialism are a grand onslaught on democracy. Now, President McKinley had to square this difficult geopolitical circle. It was his job to explain to Americans why it was right, for the first time in our history, to send American soldiers to a foreign land and shoot down people who honestly believed that they were fighting for their own freedom and national independence. He came to Boston and made a speech at a grand banquet. And he used an explanation that still resonates. Did we need their permission to perform a great act for humanity? We had it in every aspiration of their minds, in every hope of their hearts. It takes us back to this missionary view that the United States has discovered a wonderful key to the prosperous, democratic, free society, and how churlish and selfish it would be for us to keep that secret to ourselves. It's our job to spread it around the world, and the people who need it the most are the ones so backward and primitive that they don't even realize they need our help. That's the line that McKinley was predicating in that period, and it still resonates. So the Senate debate, as I said, went on for more than a month. During that month, fighting began in the Philippines. It broke out just as the vote was about to happen. leading a number of senators to suspect that this was more than just coincidence. As soon as news arrived in Washington that fighting had broken out in the Philippines, naturally some senators were more moved to vote in favor of the expansionist project. I believe that the Americans, and particularly President McKinley, truly felt that the Filipinos would welcome us. The idea that the Filipinos had been fighting against Spanish rule for years and were not ready to change one foreign ruler for another never occurred to American leaders. We felt that since the United States was so completely different from any other imperial power, everyone would welcome us. But in fact, of course, the Filipinos, like so many other peoples, viewed us just like any other interventionist power, just the opposite of what we had expected. So the final vote on the Treaty of Paris was a cliffhanger. It went down to the last day. Newspapers were speculating how many senators on this side, how many senators on the other side. The McKinley administration, through Lodge and Vice President Garrett Hobart, was very active in, let's say, distributing emoluments among senators. One immediately became a federal judge after the vote. Another one took over the naming of all the postmasters in his home state. So normal political means were used, among other great philosophical arguments, to affect the debate. The final vote on this crucial question, and I repeat, it wasn't just on a treaty or about one country. It was about the future direction of the United States. The Treaty of Paris was ratified with one vote more than the required two-thirds majority. Then the anti-imperialists took this case to the Supreme Court. They argued that it was unconstitutional for Americans to rule people anywhere without granting them basic constitutional rights. The Supreme Court rejected that argument by a vote of 5-4. And the Chief Justice who wrote the opinion had also participated in the majority in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision a couple of years earlier, which certified the constitutionality of segregation. It actually made sense, since if you believe that some people inside the United States have more rights than others, you could also believe that other peoples that we govern might have rights or might not. So you had a one-vote cushion in the US Senate, and then a one-vote margin in the Supreme Court. It was a very narrowly decided choice. It reflects the division in the American soul that persists to this day. I believe that the American interventionist impulse does not, as I had thought when I began working on this book, swing back and forth like a pendulum. That was my original perception. It was kind of like a tide, if you want to use another metaphor. Sometimes we become outraged and we're angry at people in country X. They're not behaving the way we think they should, so we overthrow their government or we invade them. And then the sorrows of empire become clear, things begin going badly, we begin to realize this doesn't always work, and we withdraw, become a little calmer, until the cycle begins again. But actually, I've now come to conclude that this impulse does not swing back and forth. Actually, both impulses exist within us at the same time. We are, as a nation, both imperialist and isolationist. We want every country to guide itself, but we also want to guide the world. Those are not compatible views. You can't hold both of them, but we do. We've never decided what John Winthrop meant back in 1630 when he famously said, we shall be as a city upon a hill when the eyes of all people are upon us. So did he mean we should go out into a sinful world and redeem it, make it godly? Or did he mean we should build a virtuous society at home and hope that others would copy it? We still want to believe both of those things, even though they're contradictory. And this is a pattern that I see all the way from Theodore Roosevelt to Barack Obama. They all begin their presidencies very excited about using military power to achieve their ends in the world. Then, as their terms proceed, they begin to see the trouble that this brings. And towards the end of their terms, they tend to be less open to intervention. So Theodore Roosevelt was a great example. Here was the greatest nation grabber in American history. When he suddenly came to power after McKinley's assassination, woe to any nation on which the U.S. had ever cast a covetous eye. There was speculation in the newspapers about where we're going next. Will we annex Guatemala or Nicaragua? Are we going to try to take over Canada? Which slices of China are we going to take? Could there be colonies in Africa open to us? But Theodore Roosevelt didn't do any of that. After his first intervention to take land for the Panama Canal, he never did it again. He moved on to other issues, principally confronting big business and working on protecting the natural environment. And later in life, he always liked to point out that he never ordered an intervention in which a single life was lost. You see that all the way up to Obama. Presidents do tend to calm down on intervention as they spend time in power, which is, I think, a positive thing, although you wish every president wouldn't have to learn the same lesson over again and take several years and several wars to do so. So for me, the great discovery of this book is that this debate ever happened. That is the episode that I'm trying to bring back. I think it also has a great message for us today. I think all of us, regardless of where we are in this debate, can take inspiration from the titans who squared off at this moment. Only once before in American history, at the founding of our nation, have so many brilliant Americans been so intensely engaged in a debate so fraught with meaning for all humanity. During the Senate debate, it was pointed out that this question was even more important than the question of slavery, because the slavery question only affected people that lived inside the United States. This decision was going to shake the whole world. Those of us in particular who are critical of some of the directions of American foreign policy can also take from this debate the inspiration of realizing that we're not making this up. Actually, we're in a rich American tradition, which in some ways has been denied to us by the disappearance of this story from our history books. We're standing on the shoulders of titans, and it's wonderful, I think, for us to realize that this is a debate that is deeply rooted in American history and that our position has a very rich American tradition. So that was the great discovery of this book. But I did make a couple of serendipitous subsidiary discoveries, which is one of the fun parts about writing books. One of them has to do with Mark Twain. So I had grown up with what I now realize is a mistaken and partial view of Mark Twain, which may have been the view that many of you grew up with. So I thought of him as a gentle old guy, beloved by all, who had curly white hair and rocked on his front porch, told funny jokes, and wrote lovely novels. Well, that's a piece of Mark Twain. But Mark Twain was vituperative. He was bitter. His writings were poisonous. And I came to understand that many of the quotes that I use in my book to illustrate this are not to be found in any biography of Mark Twain or in any anthology of Mark Twain's witticisms, because they're not really witty. They're too tough. And actually, Twain kept a folder of some of this stuff that he thought was even too tough to publish in his lifetime. So I feel now that we've bleached the image of Mark Twain. We've made him too much into a pleasant dinner guest, when actually he was not a friendly dinner guest at all, as Theodore Roosevelt came to realize. Finally, I had a wonderful discovery in learning about a person who I had never heard of before, who also was a great figure in America in his time. And that is another wonderful aspect of doing original research. I always tell my students that when you read a history book or an account of history, you're reading about two eras of history. One is the era that the book is about, but you're also reading about the era in which it was written, because that's what affects the author. That's the atmosphere that surrounds the author as he or she is writing. That's why I think some episodes disappear from history and others shine forever and are taught in every school. So Carl Schurz, anybody, just curious, anybody know that name? Maybe you lived on the east side of New York where there's Carl Schurz Park, yeah. That's the only answer I ever get. It's the park outside of Gracie Mansion. But let me ask you, you've been in Carl Schurz Park. Do you know who he was? Do you know any more about him?
No, I knew he was German, and I knew he was a senator from some other state besides New York.
Well, your knowledge of him is vast, I can tell you, compared to any other American. So Carl Schurz was one of the most interesting immigrants to come to the United States in the 19th century. He fought in the 1848 revolution in Germany as a teenager. After that rebellion was crushed, he had to flee. He came to America. He became an abolitionist, an admirer of Abraham Lincoln. He was a Civil War general. Then he went on to become a U.S. Senator from Missouri, first German-born U.S. Senator. He was Secretary of the Interior. And in the late 19th century, he was the preeminent American campaigner against corruption, for good government, for civic virtue. And he was certainly known to every literate American in that period. I not only have a photo of him in my book, but I have a political cartoon in which he appears. And every American would have recognized him. He had a curly black beard, which made him very attractive for cartoonists like Roosevelt's buck teeth and Mark Twain's curly white locks. So Carl Schurz was a extremely thoughtful and articulate anti-imperialist. His speeches are wonderfully shaped and deeply penetrating beyond the issues of the moment to the great themes of American life. On January 2nd, 1899, Carl Schurz was the speaker at the convocation of the University of Chicago. In those days, convocations at major universities were national events. Important figures were invited and expected to pronounce themselves on grand questions. Carl Schurz delivered a stirring 11,000-word address in which he listed every argument in favor of expansion and overseas wars and imperialism and demolished them. The economic argument, the strategic argument, the moral argument, the political argument. And he concluded with a line from which I take the title of my book. Today I'm not going to do the whole 11,000 words, but let me read you in closing the line that I found inspirational enough to use as the title for my book, but I also believe this is an admonition for today. This is Carl Schurz speaking to us. Let us raise high the flag of our country, not as an emblem of reckless adventure and greedy conquest, of betrayed professions and broken pledges, of criminal aggressions and arbitrary rule over subject populations, but the old, the true flag, the flag of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the flag of government of, for, and by the people, the flag of national faith held sacred and of national honor unsullied, the flag of human rights and of good example to all nations, the flag of true civilization, peace, and goodwill to all men. Thanks. Great, thank you. Great to be here. Thank you. Before I take questions, I just want to add my voice to all of those who have expressed gratitude to the Watson Institute, to Rick Locke and his successor, Ed Steinfeld. Those of us who work here have a magnificent intellectual environment. It's dedicated to producing written work as well as teaching. That written work is largely scholarly and original, but the writing of non-scholarly work is also encouraged in this building as an important part of contributing to Americans' understanding of the world. And that's not true in very many institutes at which international relations are studied in this country. So I'm most grateful to be here, and without that orientation in this institution, I wouldn't be here, and this book probably wouldn't have been written also. So I'm grateful not just to Rick, but to the institution that has given me the platform from which to launch this latest missile. Thank you. We have some time. I'd be happy to pick up some more pieces if any of you have any questions.
I have a question about foreign aid. I mean, Americans have. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hi. Great talk. This is my favorite that I've been to the Watson so far, and it's just great.
Keep coming. There's a lot of good ones
I'm
to
taking
come.
your class next semester, that's for sure. But I wanted to talk about foreign aid because there are diseases, easily preventable diseases that people in developing nations get that we haven't seen in the West for 50 years, diseases that our pets don't even get. And so I'm all for like not waging wars, but what if we wage wars against poverty or against diseases or other types of humanitarian aid causes? Then is American intervention acceptable?
The United States is always going to be intervening in the world just because of our size and our power. It's inevitable. So the key is not to try to prevent this, but to try to shape it in a positive way. You're absolutely right that the United States has a magnificent role to play in the world, as long as it's not confrontational, as long as it's working with other countries instead of against them. Now, one of the things that I notice as I travel around the world is that despite all of our sins, huge numbers of people have tremendous admiration for the United States. They admire us. They want what we have. And they want to have a society like ours. The United States has a great story to tell in the world, but we're not telling it. We've given up, essentially, on trying to promote that aspect of our society, which I think is the essence of our society. All of our libraries and America houses and consulates are being turned into fortresses or closed. And now we're giving too many people in the world the idea that the face of America is night raids, drone attacks, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, foreign interventions. This is not who we are, but it's the face that we show too often. Our foreign policy has become heavily militarized. The military is the institution that we reach for first. One reason for that is what makes us bad imperialists. We're not really prepared to be imperialists. We became an empire by accident. We didn't set out to do it like the British or the Belgians or the Spaniards. We never created any equivalent of the British colonial service. People who understand other countries, learn their cultures and languages. The reason we didn't do that is because if you have a colonial service, it must mean that you have colonies. And we were trying to pretend that we didn't. So when we want to project power, the only instrument we have is the military, which is the wrong instrument. It's like using a meat cleaver for brain surgery. This is not what a military is made for. And it shouldn't be. Because militaries that spend their time taking little children to vote and digging wells lose their tough edge that you need when war comes. So they're not social workers, but that's the job we often put them into. I would love to see a shift from our foreign policy away from military toward diplomatic. You know, Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, famously told his colleague, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, once that he said, "I have more people in my military bands than you have diplomats in the entire State Department." And it's true. That gives you a sense of how imbalanced our approach to the world is. For many years, the United States felt invulnerable. We understood that our foreign interventions created blowback, but it didn't reach our shores. In the modern world, that isolation is over. We need to be thinking more seriously about cooperating with other countries. And allies, partners, only emerge when they like you, when they admire you, when they want to help you, when they feel a sense of common interest. And if we don't project a sense that we are a country that people want to be allied with, they won't ally with us. You know, how many countries in the world are allies of China? China's not a country that automatically makes governments or nations or people think, I want to be like you, I want to be your friend. But America's the opposite. We draw people by who we are. And that's why it's so important to show people who we really are.
Great talk, Stephen, as usual. Great to have you here at Watson. Couple questions. One is, could you just tell us how you chose this particular book? I mean, you've written books about all over the world, range of subjects, time periods. How did this one hit you? What was the spark that got you on this? And second of all, since we're at Brown, and Brown's most famous diplomat is John Hay. The John Hay Library. He coined the term "splendid little war," I believe, to describe the Spanish-American War. And in fact, my professorship is the John Hay professor. So, did he play any part in your narrative in your book?
Two great questions. So, and thank you, Peter, for being the first guy that I saw at the Watson Institute who said, "Why don't you check out Watson Institute and come to work here?" As for how I came up with the idea of writing this book. In a larger sense, it's what I mentioned earlier, that I'm looking for untold stories. But how did I find this one? Well, I read a lot about the Spanish-American War. I know a lot about it, and I teach about it every year. And this story, to me, is a huge part of the Spanish-American War story. You can't tell the story without this. But this piece never appears. And it's somewhere in a book I saw a mention that somebody made a speech at something called the Anti-Imperialist League, which I had never heard of. Then I started reading and began understanding the scope of this institution. And then what were the forces that gave birth to the Anti-Imperialist League? Now, what was the debate? And this led me to realize how close the debate was. Then I began plunging myself into the original sources and realized that this was an enormous episode that shook a nation and shook the world. People were watching the Senate debate all over the world. Diplomats posted in Washington were sending out reports every day. So I came to realize that there was a big piece of this story missing, and I set out to find it. It's pretty hidden, but not hidden well enough for somebody at the Watson Institute. As for John Hay, he did play a role in this. So he was Secretary of State under both McKinley and Roosevelt, as Roosevelt kept him on after McKinley's assassination. Hay, to me, is a fascinating figure. I always talk about him. I devote at least a half a class to him every year, because I think if we're not going to teach about him at Brown, where are they going to do it? As a matter of fact, I have to tell you the story that when I joined the Watson Institute, as you'll remember, there was a portrait of John Hay out in the corridor as soon as you came in. And one day it disappeared, and I find out it's in a locked conference room. And I protested. And the explanation that came back was, it's not that we didn't want John Hay, it's that the picture is dark, old-fashioned, kind of lugubrious, and it doesn't convey the excitement and the color that we want to think of the Watson Institute as representing. But I still take people into that room to see the picture, bow down a little bit. So John Hay, of course, had seen the entire second half of the 19th century. He had gone from being private secretary to Abraham Lincoln to being Secretary of State 50 years later under McKinley. You know, at Brown, he was known as Hashish Johnny. I'm not going any further into that one. But he had some interesting aspects to his life. I'll tell you another one. While he was working with Henry Cabot Lodge to push the Treaty of Paris through the Senate, he was having an affair with Lodge's wife. I think that Hay was one of the more reluctant imperialists. He did support, naturally, the project. He was the Secretary of State. But I think he also did understand some of the problems that this might cause. I think Hay was a calming influence on both McKinley and Roosevelt. He was also a great writer and a great phrase maker. That's why he came up with this wonderful phrase for the Spanish-American War, a splendid little war. And I just finished by telling you this. You may not realize it, but two Brown graduates came very close to become President of the United States. So one was Charles Evans Hughes, who ran against Woodrow Wilson for president in 1912. And with just the moving of a few hundred votes in a couple of states, he would have become president. He's the only person that resigned from the Supreme Court to run for president. But John Hay also was very close. So John Hay was Secretary of State under Roosevelt when there was no vice president because there had been an assassination. At that time, Secretary of State was number 2 in line for the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt was on a trip to Pittsfield, Massachusetts when he had a serious crash in his streetcar. And a spike went through his bodyguard next to him and killed him. It's like a Secret Service agent. If they had switched seats, Roosevelt would have been killed and John Hay would have been Secretary of State. And we would have had a Brown graduate. But I always say to my students, it's still a vacancy. That's still a title out there. First president of the U.S. from Brown. Keep it in mind.
You mentioned the word plutocracy, and I really kind of think we've become a plutocratic republic. But I wonder how much of the change in our foreign policy do you think it's because of the priorities of the plutocrats?
So the question was, the priorities of the plutocrats, how much do they shape American foreign policy? I think quite a bit, depending on how you define plutocrats. Certainly, what we call the defense industry is a very powerful force in shaping American policy. Every time one of these giant procurement projects for something like the F-35 aircraft is approved by Congress, the first thing the defense contractors do is slice up the contract and give pieces of it to every district of a congressman who has an important vote in Washington. It means that the congressmen are then immobilized. They can't vote against these projects because otherwise they're throwing people out of work in their own districts. And I can sympathize with that, but it's a fiendishly effective technique, especially when combined with the campaign contributions to favored senators. In addition, the economic motive has always been an important part of the American push abroad. It's too simple to say that we fight all our foreign wars for plunder, but there's always been an aspect of that. During the debate over the Philippines and the Treaty of Paris that I talk about in my book, for example, this argument comes very strongly to the fore. The resources of the Philippines were a great topic during the Senate debate. In fact, Senator Albert Beveridge, the only senator who actually went to the Philippines and was a great imperialist, came back and gave a list of all the products that the Philippines produced and talked about how rich the land was. And he actually held up a gold nugget that he said he had picked out of a river in the Philippines. You couldn't have had a more graphic image of what American foreign policy is all about. So the resources of the Philippines were important to us, but also the markets. One of the things that comes very clear as you read through the newspapers and magazines of that era, as I did, is that an obsession in that period was what was called glut. So American farmers and manufacturers were producing more than Americans could consume. And this was causing problems in the United States. That was the root of labor upheaval. We had strikes. We had Pinkertons shooting down labor leaders on the streets in many cities. There were worries about instability in the U.S. And the theme of these articles always at the end is, we need foreign markets. And you can't trade with Europe because Europe has tariff walls. You can't trade with European colonies because that was the whole point of taking colonies. You trade with them and no one else can. So we need colonies of our own. The Philippine market was seen as a great lure, but the big one was the China market. You hear about this all the time in these articles. It's a great fata morgana out there that the Philippines could be our springboard into the China market. And there were articles speculating on how many head of cattle we could sell in a year in China if we could get the Chinese to eat beef instead of rice and vegetables. Or if we could get the Chinese to wear cotton clothing. How much cotton could you export in a year? These were great, fascinating prospects for American business people. In the current age, I think foreign policy is aimed at protecting our security, and that's economic in part. I think that's actually a reasonable goal for foreign policy of any country, to protect your national economy. I like to think that the United States should define its vital interests down very narrowly, because vital interests are the ones you want to go to war for. But protecting the sea lanes, for example, on which our economy depends, is a very legitimate vital interest of the United States. On the other hand, we sometimes follow policies for economic purposes, and then after the economic purposes are gone, we still keep following them. One of the great weaknesses of American foreign policy is its lack of agility. We don't change when the world changes. And a great example, talking about economics, is the Persian Gulf. We have ships all over the Persian Gulf. I was just there over the winter break, and it's a narrow waterway just made for confrontation. We have our whole Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. Why are we there? Well, we're there for two reasons. One is to keep the Soviet Union out, and the other is to assure that the Saudi oil on which our economy depends can get to us safely. But neither of those applies anymore. Actually, the oil that goes through the Persian Gulf, that Saudi oil that we're spending billions of dollars to protect, it's going to China. We're paying to keep the Persian Gulf safe for Chinese and Japanese and Indian oil. So the economic motive is always there. It's not the one we hear about. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the humanitarian motive is the one that people like to trot out when they want to promote interventions. And whatever the real motivation is, I would always advise the president, cloak it in some kind of bogus humanitarian concern or real humanitarian concern, and then you'll get people to support it. But behind that lies much more. Yes.
Thank you for a very wonderful early afternoon and illuminating some of the issues that we've been dealing with throughout my lifetime and the lifetime of my predecessors. So thank you. A commentary, you might think about sending a copy of this book gratis to the White House. So that,
Could I reduce it down to like 3 sentences?
no, the full volume, so that maybe people there understand that allies are good for purposes other than just military. Then an observation. You use the term, I think you solely use the term anti-imperialist. Mm-hmm. Have we substituted another word for that term called isolationism, which has clearly I think in the minds of many people, a negative sense, where anti-imperialism has a positive ring to it? Thank you
Interesting.
again.
Thank you. Well, first of all, about sending my book to Washington. I actually did have a wonderful event there just last week, and it was in the Army and Navy Club. The guy sitting next to me on one side was the former Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and the guy on the other side was the former Secretary of the Navy. And that was the whole room, and they were very positive. They were surprisingly willing to accept all of this. So I sometimes think it's a mistake to feel that the real push for militarism comes from the military. You'd like to think that would make everything easier, but it's not always the way. There's all the chicken hawks in Congress that are the real militarists. Your last question truly reflects a lamentable fact, and that is that in the war of terminology, in the lexicographical world, we lost. So imperialism is not really a word to be used in polite society. Isolationism, as you point out, is a very negative word. But the other side has all the good phrases. So they don't call themselves imperialists or their agenda expansionist. It's the freedom agenda, humanitarian intervention, liberal hegemony. We are only trying to help people. So I think we lost that war somehow, maybe just narrowly, like we lost the battle for the Treaty of Paris. But you're right. Even after the end of the conflict that I write about, as the anti-imperialists were sitting around glumly for what amounted to a bit of a funeral at one of their clubs in Boston, and they were trying to dissect what went wrong. They had a variety of reasons. The timing was off if it had taken another year, and there were various other speculations. But one of the thoughts that came up was maybe the phrase anti-imperialist also hurt us because it sounds like we're against something. And Americans want to be for something, and we were never able to shape it in a way that seemed positive enough. You'd like to think that choosing the right terminology and coming up with the right phrases wasn't so crucial, but since it is, I became a writer. Remember that the opening line of one of our greatest books says, "In the beginning was the Word." And as masters of the word, we have to campaign to find a better phrase for our perspective. I agree with you.
Thanks. Stephen, were there any antecedents to this debate in the conquest of Native American lands, moving west and south?
America's progression to empire came in phases. And I would single out three. I'd say there were three phases. The first phase, as you point out, was what I would call continental empire. We cleared out the Indians or put them in reservations. We captured half of Mexico, and we created our empire in North America. The second stage came as a result of the debate that I spoke about today. That brought us from being a continental empire to being an offshore empire or an overseas empire. And then after World War II, we took the final step and became a global empire. So you're right that, that expansionism was not anything new, as the expansion of the United States into the rest of North America also constituted expansionism. The Mexican War did arouse controversy, and Abraham Lincoln was one of the few who spoke up as a member of Congress. It's one of the reasons that he lost. You know, Abraham Lincoln served one term in Congress and then was defeated. One of the main reasons was his opposition to the Mexican War. In fact, that's what got him his first nickname. I don't know if you know about this, but during the famous debate in which the White House claimed that, President Polk claimed that Americans had been shot at on American territory, which actually wasn't true, and Lincoln suspected this. He made a speech demanding that somebody come from the State Department or the White House and show the spot exactly on a map where this took place. And he used this phrase several times. He said, "Show me the spot where it happened. Where is the spot?" And he became known as Spotty Lincoln. And that was used against him as a person who undermined an American military mission, which was the same argument that was used against people who were opposed to American intervention in the Philippines. I don't think there was much opposition to American policies toward the Indians, largely for racial reasons. Very few Americans would have thought that Indians were in a position to govern themselves or have any kind of civilized life. They were barbarians and headhunters, like Theodore Roosevelt would have called them. In fact, he had a famous line: "I don't believe that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. But I do think that 9 out of 10 are, and I wouldn't argue too much about the 10th." So that kind of attitude, I think, prevented any sympathy for the Indians or for the Mexicans. There was I wouldn't want to say a crescendo. There was a peep. There were a few peeps of protest. But that intervention happened very quickly, and in fact, Polk didn't even run for re-election after he had accomplished it. So I think the real debate over expansionism did not begin until we began to expand overseas. Don't forget that manifest destiny, that phrase was coined to mean it's our manifest destiny to fill up North America. Everybody in America believed that, with the exception of the poor victims. But it was when we decided to push beyond our geographical boundaries that we set off a national debate. Go ahead.
The Congress seemed to be an important place for this debate that you've talked about, and it seems like we're ripe for another debate. But what is your sense that Congress can serve as that forum, and if not Congress, how does this our next challenge shape up?
I do think that Trump represents the same divided soul that I've talked about. He represents it maybe in a less sophisticated way than many others, but he too has made wonderful anti-interventionist statements, but he's also said exactly the opposite. So it just depends on what tweet you want to believe. I believe his administration is also torn by this. I've heard him say that, I've heard those guys say, we don't want to be escalating in the Middle East, we don't want to provoke foreign wars, but we're going to have free, safe zones in Syria, and we're going to crack down on Iran. So where are we going? Perhaps the fact that the president is a Republican might lead some Democrats to want to be willing to criticize, but I must say, every time I go to Washington, which is as seldom as possible, I'm impressed with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy. Our foreign policy runs the gamut of opinions from A to B. Anything that's outside the consensus is treated as the beginnings of a frightful disease that has to be stamped out before it can affect the whole foreign policy process. And this is a closed box that is inhabited by Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, nearly every think tank in Washington. And you understand why. If you don't join the consensus, you don't eat lunch in that town. You don't get invited anywhere. Your calls don't get returned. The worst aspect of this to me is that the press is such an eager participant. I understand the motives of politicians and people who want to make their way in the Washington world, but the press is supposed to be outside this game. And I see the press falling exactly into the syndrome that we were in before the Iraq War. The over-the-top demonization of Putin, this portrayal of Russia as a predatory enemy about to crush us, the immediate full embrace of the official paradigm on Syria has led some newspapers, like the New York Times, to become even more militant than the Pentagon. So I hope there will be some rebellion against what's going to happen in Washington, but before that can happen, we have to figure out what is going to happen in Washington. I don't know. Remember that line from Rebel Without a Cause? The waitress in the diner asked Marlon Brando, "So what are you rebelling against?" To which he replies, "What do you got?" I'd like to see a little more of that attitude in Washington, but I don't see too many signs of it now.
You worked for the New York Times as a writer for 20 years?
Guilty.
C-
Guilty as charged.
Could you please talk a little more about the differences that you see from the time that you worked there and today with the press? I mean, you touched upon that a little bit. Do you think things are worse, better, the same?
I think there have been great moments in the history of the American press, but not enough of them. I was at the New York Times during the run-up to the Iraq War. It was very disturbing to me to see how the New York Times was beating the war drums with aluminum tubes and uranium from Niger and all of this. In fact, it was a factor in my decision to leave the New York Times. At that time, it looked like we might be bombing Iran. That was going to be next. As a New York Times reporter, I wasn't able to say anything about what I really thought about the Iraq reparations and what nonsense it was that we were printing in our newspaper. But I thought if I were at the New York Times, I would be allowed to say that. So that was a factor in leading me to want to liberate myself. And who knew I would wind up in the Watson Institute at the end of that string. I feel that the great change in coverage of foreign news since I was a foreign correspondent is that so much foreign news reporting that you see in the American press now is written from Washington. I always like to look at the dateline. So if I'm getting the analysis of what's really happening in Mali and it's datelined Washington, I don't read it. because I know how those reporters operate. You got a story to write. So you call the State Department. Then you call the Defense Department. You might call someone you know in the White House. You might call a couple of embassies, and then you call the think tank expert. Then you say, well, I've covered every base. I got a full story now. That's not correct. You're talking to all people who are in the same echo chamber. And that is very pernicious. So the days are gone when it was possible to do what I used to do, for example. I can remember from Istanbul calling my boss in New York and saying, I think I'd like to go to Uzbekistan for 2 weeks. And the question came back, so what's happening in Uzbekistan? I said, I don't know. Got to find out, but I'll get you some great stories. And he said, fine, take a photographer. That doesn't happen anymore. Unless there's some hard news happening, nobody gets sent. And this is why I hate news. I can admit this now after so many years as a newsman. Because news is a big distraction. News is what's happening today, right now. But that's not what's important. Two other things are more important than what's happening today. One is, what happened yesterday? How did we get here? Why is this happening? And the other is, what's going to happen tomorrow? What does it mean, what just happened? So I'm dedicated more into looking at the causes and effects rather than the actual episode. When you're so obsessed with the daily news cycle, you never ask those questions. And that's the whole point. So I try to break out of that syndrome. You know, I'm not going to write a memoir, but I have a title. Usually it works the other way. Sometimes you write a book and then you have to come up with the title. So some of you might know that old movie called Arsenic and Old Lace. The story is that Cary Grant visits his elderly aunts and discovers that the rooming house where they run is actually a place where they poison the guests. That's the whole, it's a kind of a screwball comedy. And there's a great moment when one of the aunts says to Cary Grant, oh, the gentleman died because he drank wine that had poison in it. And the horrified Cary Grant looks up and says, but how did the poison get in the wine? And that's the question I always want to ask. That's going to be the title of my memoir. How did the poison get in the wine? One more?
Just an observation, like we talked about manifest destiny. You know, this country was founded on that concept, if you look at it. I mean, here these people left England because of religious suppression, came here and created theocracies in every state except for this one. So it's pretty much ingrained in the system, in the psyche of probably all people to some extent. And I guess the idea is it's probably comes down to an individual, assessing that and finding out how we participate in that, basically.
I think you're right, but I would just take exception to one thing you said, and that is it's the same for all peoples. I think there's something special about Americans. Who are the people that would have wanted to come over here? I read Jim Webb's great book about the Scotch-Irish. That's his people. These were fighters. They were fighters in Scotland. They were fighters in Ireland. They came over here. Andrew Jackson and all these people came out of that same fighting tradition. Americans have a desire to win, to command, to dominate. Not every nation in the world feels that way. Americans are brought up with Calvinist ideals. One is the world is divided between good and evil. Many people in many cultures don't learn that. They're taught that we're all somewhat good and somewhat evil, and these qualities come out in different proportions according to different circumstances. We don't believe that. Calvinists also believe that it's not enough to sit home and hope that bad things stop happening and good things begin happening. You have to go out in the world and do God's work. We have a real missionary complex. So I do think there's something in our American psyche that contributes to our instinctive desire to want to shape the world. Let me just close with this observation, and this is the way I close my book. It goes back to George Washington's farewell address. So this speech is sometimes dismissed as quaint and old-fashioned and applying to an era that's long gone. But I don't see it that way. To me, it's full of great wisdom for America. So he listed in his farewell address in 1796 the traps that America should avoid if it wants to avoid being dragged down like other great nations have been. Here are some of them. Frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contests, overgrown military establishments, excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike of another, the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. Now, in his speech at the end, Washington admits that he realizes Americans are not going to pay attention to his rules. I dare not hope they will make the strong and lasting impression I would wish. Nonetheless, he insists on proclaiming the one principle that he says will prevent our nation from running the course which has hitherto marked the destiny of nations. Give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? I'm going to leave you with that one, our founder. Thank you. Thank you.